This is Changeling the podcast.
Welcome to Changeling the podcast, where the ogres are strapping, the wizened are crafty, and the darklings like to go ooh in the night. I'm your host Puka, and I am joined by Fetch.
A pleasure to be here. I was not ready for the woo.
It's just
Amazing. Love
noises are the best thing, I find. So in this installment, we are at long last finishing the first edition core book for Changeling the Lost. At frickin' last. Because this book goes hard. There's a lot of book in this book.
I appreciate that you're getting your bang for your buck as you go through the book, but it's perhaps the best out of character example of the in character thing of the shorter you think the journey is going to be, the longer it is.
Yeah. And we are just covering the appendices, which they're appendices, but they are respectively 36 pages and 24 pages. So they're basically chapters. Now, granted, the chapters we've already seen approach 100 pages each, but nevertheless, relativity aside, they are still quite chunky.
They're technically appendices in the sense that you could do without these contents.
Yes.
Today, as part of talking about the appendices, we'll be talking about two things which are technically optional for the game. The Z-splat called Entitlements, and the setting of Miami, Florida. After that, we will be giving our final thoughts and then going into listener questions. Are you very familiar, Puka, with the term Z-splat?
I'm so glad you used it because it's in my notes and I highlighted it because I didn't know if you used the term Z-splat. So yes, that's the short answer.
I love the term. For the listeners who do not know, traditionally when we discuss a property by White Wolf or Onyx Path, we'll talk about the 2 or 3 axes of making your character. X-axis, Y-axis, and Z-axis. To take Changeling for an example, because this is what we're discussing, your X-axis would be what kind of kith/seeming are you? Because that's an immutable aspect of your character. It's your innate trait. The Y-splat is a more general social aspect to your character. Not what you are, but what you've chosen to be, which in this case would be the 4 seasonal courts. And then finally, you might have a Z-splat, which is a specialty, something of personal interest to your character, like a secret club that may be as important to you as any of the other characteristics. In this case, that will be entitlements. Speaking of which, do we want to launch right into what entitlements are?
Yeah, well, I was also going to say with the XYZ, I think of it almost like the X is your nature, the Y is your politics or your beliefs, and the Z is almost like your occupation. I mean, that's kind of doesn't quite fit, but it's a little bit along those lines. I like your description of the X-splat as being the immutable aspect. We should probably also just say the opening story for this chapter is probably the most potentially triggering one in the book, so read with caution.
To keep it abstract for those who may be sensitive about the content, this story is a great example of a hedge tool and how you can do psychological warfare. Clearly something which needs to be approached with safety tools and caution, especially if you read this snippet. It'll give you a great understanding of why that should be the case.
Yes. Anyway, then, entitlements. So, Lost had really hitherto separated itself from Dreaming, I would say, in the lack of its commoner noble dynamic. And I didn't think I missed it, but now it's back with a vengeance in this appendix, because they're cool. I mean, They're sort of an expansion on the societies relative to Changeling the Dreaming, some of them secret, others not so much. It's almost like, in dreaming terms, you could take title in a society rather than just being a certain level of noble. And the entitlements here aren't graduated in the way title is. You're just, if you're part of the Duchy of the Icebound Heart, which is what we saw in the Quick Start adventure, you are a duke/duchess. It doesn't really outrank one title or another. That's just the term.
A tangent. I recall that at least later books in C20 introduced the concept of secret societies. You can be both a member of a noble house and a secret society. Is that correct? Or are those...
Absolutely.
Okay.
There are, in fact, certain societies that are nobles only. So, and they do
Okay.
predate C20. I have to stand for the older books as well. But yes, C20 mechanized them in a way that they hadn't really been before, which, yeah, it worked out. For entitlements, similar to certain societies in Changeling the Dreaming, you need prerequisite traits, usually including Weird 2 or 3. The book also suggests that beyond the orders that they list in this section, there might be others that are seeming or kith specific. But once you meet any requirements, you then have to roleplay through finding the order, fulfilling their tests, culminating in swearing an oath just as you would to a court. And similarly, the form that takes can vary from entitlement to entitlement, from changeling to changeling. There's also this nifty little sidebar on eldritch orders for the most powerful changelings, but we don't get much information on them here.
We will when we get to Equinox Roads, but that's going to be a while away.
Yeah, a sneak preview here. So that raises the question, why join an order? Why join an order, Fetch?
I have to say that the mechanical benefit of it is not as compelling to me as the social benefit. If you join an order, you get either a cool token or a special merit that is appropriate to the order that you have joined. It helps them accomplish whatever the entitlement has set out to do. But I think more importantly than that, it is the social benefits they have. Most entitlements are well regarded or feared by freeholds at large. They have legends that cast a long shadow and act as support groups for your interests. So, to take a brief example, the magistrates of the Wax Mask are an order that dedicate themselves to making sure that changing rituals and gala functions go perfectly. But they're also the order that winds up in charge of who's on the guest list for those activities. And they have their own internal politicking, which can have a vast influence over how those situations go. So if you join the Wax Mask, you have a lot of cultural baggage that comes with that.
And to your point about these being optional, I don't think I've ever had entitlements come up in the Lost games that I've played. I've certainly never had a character who was entitled. And to say like, oh, they're the ones who manage the guest list, if you don't play with them, you can still have that be like an angle in your story. It's just that if you do choose to include entitlements, then they kind of have it baked in.
I have had entitlements come up in my game before, but that is in 2nd edition Changeling, which is when I first got around to really running the game. And by that point, they've handled entitlements very differently.
Yeah.
Oh, last thing I should say is that the benefits that you'll get with joining an order will vary. Some are minor, some are pretty impressive. The idea is that the higher the prerequisites for joining the group, the better the benefit that you're meant to get out of it. And I don't think there's any experience cost attached with it. You just meet it and get to join.
Well, short of the XP that you need to spend on getting the prerequisites, potentially.
Sure.
I like the note, incidentally. So you also get some cool changes to your Famine if you're into that. And it notes that these are more ephemeral than the sort of permanent mean underneath because they're fashioned from glamour rather than through endurance. And I don't know why, but I like that as a note about the metaphysics of like different aspects of the mean. So There is also a slight disadvantage to being entitled, which is that you are now noteworthy in the eyes of the true Fae, for better or
That's
for worse.
right.
So,
Yes.
and I don't know, I can't remember if they actually kept that in second edition, because I never used them in second edition, but it does certainly add to the feel here of the others being, like the more power you attain, the more like them you become, and that's not necessarily what you want. So they will always notice you first.
They get into, again, the bittersweet note of the obvious disadvantage of this is that attracting the attention of any of the Fae is usually a terrible idea. You do not want that. But the potential upside of it is that since they see you as something akin to a peer, that since you get to have that conversation, that does mean that there is a chance to negotiate with them, possibly achieve something that you would not otherwise, since otherwise the interaction is presumably immediately violent.
Or just not to your benefit. Anyway.
Right.
So how would you say, as someone who's played a variety of the Chronicles of Darkness games, how do these compare with other Z-splats?
Oh, good question. Let's see. Comparing it to the other ones, we have I have to try to remember them. We have the Bloodlines in Vampire. We have the Lodges in Werewolf. We have the Legacies in Mage. And then some of the others, I think, do or do not have a Z-splat. But I think that they're all similar in the sense that all of the ones I'm thinking of are strong social groups, that they strongly define who you are as a character more so than whatever your seeming or your court may be. An entitlement is kind of your job.
Mhm.
And there's a similar vibe with Bloodlines, Lodges, and Legacies where this is something that you signed up for very specifically. I think, though, that the entitlements are a bit more kind of easygoing mechanically than what I remember from the others. Like, they are way easier to get into than a Legacy in Mage, I think. And they don't give you as many benefits as you would get out of becoming part of a bloodline in Vampire, but you also don't have to deal with an additional drawback.
Yeah.
They're just kind of cool to join. So, from a mechanical perspective, there's no reason to not at least take a look at them and see if something clicks with you. And I don't think that it's going to, at least mechanically, do much to a storyteller's game if you want to sign up for one. Though I think the narrative of them can drastically inform the game, which is something I look forward to talking about as we go through this.
It also seems like one can ally with an order more intensively than with a court, for example, or if one desires, whether the player desires or the storyteller wants the game to go in that direction, you can very much have a game be about members who share an entitlement. Like that can be their unifying theme. The reason for their
Everybody being part of the Scarecrow Ministry or the Bishopric of Blackbirds does sound like a lovely game to me.
Well, speaking of those bishops, so I'm going to just go into, I have a handful of sentences for each of these, and it is, I mean, there's a lot of detail for them. So yes, we start with the Bishopric of Blackbirds. And each of these, I should say, the write-up, it gives you sort of an overview of what the entitlement involves, the titles that they use, their prerequisites for joining, what joining looks like, the changes to their mean, the background of the changelings who tend to join, the way they organize themselves, and some key concepts. Lastly, the privileges, which can be the token or whatever. And a really nifty thing is each one of these has 3 rumors that characters might have heard so that you can work the entitlement into the narrative of your story. I did think that was pretty cool. Anyway, so the Bishopric of Blackbirds. They provide aid to freeholds, always in exchange for payment or a favor, sometimes to be determined later. Sometimes the payment is to become a Blackbird bishop in turn when they do some good for you. There's a bit in here about how the Blackbird is both a good and a bad omen, which is reflected by how, yes, the help they provide doesn't come free, but they often provide it at the risk of their own clarity. They're very Whether out of altruism or righteousness or simply need for something to do, they have this willingness to help others. You need to have weird to and empathy to join. Some of the sample concepts they suggest include crazy street preacher, drug counselor, experimental psychotherapist, head of a homeless shelter, new age guru, old gang leader, or self-righteous ex-reverend. You get some bird vibes to your meme, you wear a bird pendant, and you get a token container called an aspersorium, which holds water that can ease derangements. So, helpful burbs.
I love the bishopric. They're an excellent example of something in the game that has a negative aspect to it in that they're risking their clarity. They are taking a heroic action by helping out people, oftentimes for little reward to themselves. Also, their token itself is very useful. Reducing or temporarily eliminating derangements can be a big deal in a game where a character's struggle to maintain their sense of reality is a major problem. They're maybe closest in vibe to how I understand House Liam is often described in Changeling, which is they tend to be very humanist and helpful towards people. I love these folks.
Yeah. Next up, the College of Worms. They are scholars of fate, reading omens and scouring lore and foretelling the future, especially to see when the true Fae might be coming. They've held this role for centuries. You need Weird 3, Investigation 2, and Occult 2 to join, and you start with an apprenticeship anywhere from a month to 10 years in length. You're ready when your mentor tests your perceptiveness around signs and omens. The nice thing here is that mentors never give up on their students. If they don't pass the first test, they'll try again, and they just keep trying to get their student to break through into awareness or whatever. There is a slightly gross change to the mean where it looks like worms are crawling under your skin, but you also get these cool little eyeglasses. Although I'm left with the question, if you already wear glasses, then what happens then? Do you get like extra Fae frames or something?
I would assume the real answer, I think, is they become fancier. The funny answer is you have like an extra ear that's always on the top of your head.
Or in the back of your head. Oh, eyes in the back of your head.
I like that.
Mostly, it's made up of academics and conspiracy theorists, mostly focused on mental traits. Concept examples include asylum escapee, author of cult conspiracy novels, computer programmer, doctor of neuroscience, homicide detective, professor of British literature, or sufferer of synesthesia. Awesome. And the token is a bespoke divining tool that is suited specifically to your character.
The biggest thing that I want to say about the College of Worms is that they perfectly express something I noticed throughout the entitlements. I think every entitlement in this book takes one of the concepts that we've talked about previously. How do we heal clarity loss in deals with the bishops? And the College of Worms gets into the idea of the occult being everywhere, and that being a way that changelings draw upon their magic, that they intensely focus upon the concept of what is magic. They find magic in every little coincidence that they see. And that narrative note really drives home the purpose of the entitlement, but I think can also drive home the concept itself. So if you've read any part of the book and you're like, I don't really get what's the deal with how changelings learn magic, come back and look at the entitlements. Look at the College of Worms for that specifically, or look at the others for examples of other concepts.
I take that. Next is the Duchy of the Icebound Heart, which we saw in the demo adventure from the intro materials episode. These are MasterCon artists who like to mess with emotions, especially love and lust. They tend to be rather vain and short-sighted, however. You need Weird 2, Persuasion 2, Subterfuge 2, and Winter Mantle 1 to join, so you must be of the Winter Court, to the everlasting annoyance of Spring, who insists that desire is their thing to mess around with. Essentially, you join the ranks of the Order by doing as they do, and by impressing them with your manipulations. They were often, as mortals, too emotionally available or sensitive, and this was abused by the Fae, so they are turning the table, so to speak, but Really, that means reproducing the monstrosity of their keepers in many cases. The concepts include bitter waif, broken-hearted housewife hag, consummate cheater, codependent cheater, everybody's favorite bartender, owner of dating service, pathological liar, polyamorous puppet master, shallow courtesan, and vindictive courtier. They get some frostiness to their means, with constant frozen tears clinging to their face. They like to travel and party together, but they're not supposed to mess with each other. And lastly, their privilege is heart hooks, where they get +3 social dice against the broken-hearted. Pretty nasty.
They are a great example of a, honestly, villainous organization within the Lost. I think they perfectly express a concept of changelings, which is the bitter politicking and the messing around with mortals, and the ice-hearted lady as a concept, which I'm guessing was the inspiration.
Mhm.
But I feel like they would have done better if there was a separate section saying, hey, these work better as antagonists, especially because the reader might pick up from the general description and especially the concepts that the Duchy of the Icebound Heart are terrible, terrible people.
Yeah.
I would be very cautious about including them in the game in the first place. All of the content warnings for this one. But otherwise, if you want the kind of themes of them in the game, fantastic antagonists.
Yeah. I would be a little bit cautious about allowing players to take that on, though. It's maybe a bit too much.
That would be a challenge to do with their ethos, yes.
Yeah. Moving on, the magistrates aforementioned of the Wax Mask. They pretend to be servants of the people, but in reality, they ensure the courts keep up their side of pledges with the changelings of their freehold, ranging from party planning to potent magic. I basically see them as like seneschals and oath keepers, but to your point about them keeping the guest list, I'm like, yes, they have some more power behind the throne stuff going on. You need Weird 3 to join, and that's basically it. You just have to be willing to work a demanding side hustle. You get a slowly oozing wax mask to wear in your mead if you want.
Great.
I like how they went to the trouble of giving sigils for each of these, but theirs is just disgusting, I have to say. So they are strictly organized, often favoring mental or social traits. Concepts include Bacchanalian party planner, Bacchanalian beast, control freak administrator, number cruncher, political advisor, queen's right-hand advisor, savvy bureaucrat, and social butterfly. The token you get is the Waxen Violet. It makes you appear humble and trustworthy, and gives you 3 social dice on things.
I feel like the benefit you get from them is mechanically not great, but this is a good example of one where if you include it in the game and take it at face value that they are that influential, and you like politics in a game, then you can play a character that has a ton of influence in the freehold, or run them as antagonists and say that they're the ones constantly getting in the Motley's way when they want to have a meeting with the Winter Queen. And oh no, it would be simply inappropriate to do that without having brought a certain gift you can only get somewhere deep in the hedge. Who wrote the rules? Who can say?
I have a particular vision of what I would play one as, but I'll keep it to myself in case I ever do. Next up is the Margaret of the Brim, who hang out on the borderlands of freeholds, finding court politics and most of changeling society treacherous and not worth their time. But they are sworn to protect it. They are militaristic and dour. You need Weird 2 and Clarity 5 and no allegiance to courts or other orders. You have to also live outside the freehold, according to the maps they carefully keep, which, as a brief aside, is this something that you get the sense any other changelings really keep track of? Like, it talks about how the Margaret kind of keeps these detailed records of which courts own where within an area, but it's like...
Thank you for bringing this up, because my answer is no.
Right.
No, I don't think anybody does. When they talk about the freehold, it's several things are wrong here. If you don't mind me jumping into it.
Jump in.
So the Margraves are an odd organization because they talk about defending the borders of the freehold, but there's never anything earlier in the book that indicates that a freehold has borders
Right.
other than maybe what are the borders of the town or city that the freehold is located in. And changelings don't have any restriction on where they can live in a city. They can go anywhere in the mortal world. And they are very active in the mortal world, partially out of desire and partially because they have to be. So I thought maybe the idea was okay, well, they patrol just the known hedgeways, which are something that are
Mm.
more difficult to map. But no, in fact, they talk very much about how the Margraves prefer to spend their times on the physical, mortal borders of the world, which seems like the worst place to be if your goal is to look out for Fey threats. Like, yes, you are sometimes going to have some monster coming in from the mortal world that's a threat, but that seems like something which is unrelated to their remit and unclear how they would police.
Yeah.
I don't think the border concept makes sense. This feels like it was a misunderstanding or an abandoned concept.
There is an interesting kind of story arc to maybe pursue there, though, because they get a bunch of little bonuses to things like initiative and stealth within the territory that they vociferously defend. And within that territory, they sort of adhere to strict democracy with everybody contributing their skills to the cause. So, from the perspective of a freehold and the courts within it, they are setting up their own little society on the doorstep. And they might say, oh, no, we're just here to protect you. But fundamentally, they are sociologically a threat to the way of life in the freehold. So I could see some tension evolving there. But yeah, it is a little bit strange.
They're a good example of another antagonistic faction. They don't
Hmm.
explicitly say this, but this seems like a good example of a relatively benign militia organization. To their credit, I don't think there's anything about them harming other changelings or forcibly recruiting them into their cause, but they also want nothing else to do with the greater
Right.
court structure. I just find them a weird fit. I think they're the one that I like the least out of the group because while I appreciate the concept they're going for, I don't think that they fit well with the narrative that we have for CTL so far.
Nevertheless, their concepts include angry dissenter, ex-noble from one of the courts, mad exile from the freehold, paranoid defender, political activist, reluctant liaison, spy for the courts, unpretentious leader, and weird nonconformist union leader. On the back of that last one alone, I'm okay with them. But
Side note, while we're on the subject, I feel like despite the book's reassurance that weird has a lot to do with the benefits that you get from joining the group, the prerequisites don't really seem to have as much of an influence as I would have expected. Like the wax and masks mechanical benefit, I don't think is as good as the one you get from the Margraves of the Brim.
oh yeah, they're fantastic. I mean, in their home turf at least. Yeah. Speaking of warrior types, though, the next one up is the Sacred Band of the Golden Standard, who are the warrior poets and glory hounds. They also protect the freehold and undertake other heroic deeds, but they mainly do it for fame and praise. If it happens to be the moral thing to do, cool. But they're certainly not immune to corruption, with vanity often overtaking their honor. If you have Weird 2 and Presence 3 and you do something awesome, you can try to get in. Earnest begging will also do the trick, although the members tend to look down on the ones who got in that way. Most of them were already notable or notorious for one reason or another. Their concepts include things like arrogant jock, bogatir, decorated police officer, el gran luchadore, ex-firefighter, famous stripper, heroic soldier, martial arts teacher, pompous pretty boy, renowned stripper, and rodeo king. I'm not sure. I don't know what the distinction is between famous stripper and renowned stripper, but all right.
Well, I don't think you need both of them in there. Look, the concept list doesn't always make a lot of sense.
They cultivate impressive means, in any case, enhanced by a glowing aura or halo, and they generally don't compete with each other. They combine their skills and give each other nicknames based on their deeds, like you would see in some kind of epic poem group. And once per scene, they can spend a glamour to add their highest physical trait to their presence as their sweet Benny. So
Not bad.
these are the nobles noble, I would say.
They are ridiculous and I love them. They
Yeah.
can flip between being either amusing but effective showboats who chew the scenery whenever they show up, to being toxic glory hounds who are the ones who try to snatch things out from beneath someone else for their own benefit. They work great as either a player character or an antagonistic faction. Their benefit is pretty neat, and their entitlements benefit where they have a little glow about them. Maybe me reading in, but this feels a little bit like, hey, do you like the Exalted from the game of the same name? Why not play one of these guys? It's fun.
Oh, I just thought of them as the she. They're just the she. It's like...
Huh. I did not think of the she in that direction. They don't feel like nobles?
I think that they are the lost equivalent of your basic she, but I can see an Exalted parallel as well, I suppose. Yeah.
What do we have next?
Next is the Satrapy of Pearls. They rely on the principle that everything is for sale, from luxuries to emotions to experiences. They can get you anything, but they will never steal, because that would be not commercial. You need Weird 3, Spring Mantle 2, therefore you must be of Spring Court, and Persuasion 2. Then you have to prove your worthiness in a challenge of proper acquisition. The order actually prefers those who worked their way up from poverty rather than the narcissistic and generally wealthy powermongers some of them become. Their concepts include things like acquisitions attorney, eccentric antiquarian, gleeful mammonite, high-priced prostitute, Iago, procurer of pledges, snake oil salesman, or spider in the center of a web, which is not that helpful as a concept. Certainly, their mien reflects luxury with weirdly pearlescent eyes that they get, and they're mostly social focused, but they don't really have much organization internally. Joining them gets you a social skill specialty, so that's pretty cool. They seem particularly well suited for Goblin Market plotlines, so I'm automatically on board.
I think they're all right. They didn't resonate very strongly with me, but yeah, you're right. If you want to get into the concept of characters that deal with either the accumulation of magical doodads or the buying and trading of anything from skills to favors, then I highly recommend checking them out.
Doodad dealers. That's a good summary. Next, the Scarecrow Ministry. All right, so...
yeah, here we go.
So this merry band, they embody fearful urban legends, often taking on their names and identities, via anything from spreading stories and rumors up to and including actual murder. They believe humans and changelings alike aren't scared enough, whether of the true Fae or the many other denizens of the world of darkness. Naturally, they don't hang on to their clarity very long. Point of order, was this 2 drafts of the same section back to back that one was supposed to get cut?
I did not pick up on that vibe. Explain.
Well, all right. So like on page 313 at the top of the right-hand side, it's after it's talking about all the stuff they do, it says, so why do they do it? Humans and even other changelings aren't scared enough. So then go back to page 314, go down, and it says, why do they do it? Ultimately, though, the reason is that humanity isn't scared enough. And I'm like, wait, hang on. This is repeating itself.
That feels like that got missed in an editing pass.
Yeah, it's like, it even starts with the same, like, why do they do it? How do they do it? And then on the next page, why do they do it? How do they do it? So anyway, so you need Weird 3, Manipulation 3, and Autumn Mantle 2, because obviously this is an Autumn Court thing. Usually they test possible candidates, those who have known horror, with fear, rather than people signing up. Imagine that. There's not like a line of changelings waiting to join this murder hobo cult. Concepts include conspiracy nut, bully, dream shaper, master storyteller, out-of-work actor, prodigal dream shaper, reluctant government spook, schoolyard bully, urban legend personified, special effects guru, victim of abuse. I feel like urban legend personified is something that you become after you join. Yeah. So it seems like redundant to have that be a concept. Also, dream shaper versus prodigal dream shaper. I'm like, okay.
Again, I don't know why they bothered doing that.
Yeah. Obviously, they dress the part of the urban legend they channel, with their memes reflecting it more and more strongly as weird increases. Some form organized motleys, which really made me think of the gentleman from Buffy the Vampire Slayer as like inspiration. But uniformly, they are a secret order. You get a token Halloween mask that instills phobia. And that's the Ministry.
The Scarecrow Ministry is one of my favorite groups. They have a sinister aspect to them that what they're doing obviously is terrifying people, but they do it for a good reason. That they're trying to keep mortals from wandering into the hedge. So rather than let the mortals go through and encounter the uncontrolled chaotic terrors of the hedge and Arcadia, they give them a controlled experience of fear that ostensibly keeps mortals away from these dangerous locations.
Ostensibly.
Well, as your weird lowers, that can become a problem for sure.
So then, last but not least, the Toll Taker Knighthood. They are the foulest mercenaries among changelings, but they have a code of honor. They won't accept a bounty without proof that justifies their assignment. Each local group of knights has its morality set by their leader, called a banneret, and they don't often go in for death or torture, but violence is certainly par for the course. You need to have Weird 2, Brawl or Firearms or Weaponry 2, and Summer Mantle 1, so woo Summer Court. Naturally, you have to endure a gauntlet of physical tests to join, but then also some moral tests in accordance with the banneret's guidance. Some of these knights are selfish, some seek to feel that they're doing the right thing in some way. Their concepts include things like club bouncer, corrupt cop, ex-con, greedy gangster, mob leg breaker, naive brute, neighborhood watch member, opportunistic rogue, sociopath, street gang vigilante, and summer court enforcer. And obviously, they're physical trait oriented. They have blood-stained means, and they get combat bonuses against anyone against whom they have a bounty.
Yeah, their benefit is pretty good.
Yeah.
They're also organized under a single person. So you have the person in head of the organization who is the one who actually takes on the bounties that everyone else follows.
Yeah. So it's interesting to think about, like, oh, if the position changes, suddenly it's like, nope, we're all totally fine with breaking knees now. But no fire. Fire's not allowed. So, favorite out of all of them?
Out of all of them, hard choice. I love the Scarecrow Ministry, the Sacred Band, and the Magistrates of Wax. I think the Scarecrow Ministry is my favorite. I have a member of it in my game right now who's doing a gender bent Jason Voorhees kind of thing where she scares people off of the more dangerous trods in the hedge or keeps the mortals from running into the worst places. But because she spends so much time living this life, she struggles with clarity. And there's a fun side story about her trying to reconnect to her humanity by dealing with another character who has some similar concerns, but from a different angle. So they can be safe around each other because neither is scared of accidentally hurting the other or terrifying each other. What about you? Which one's your favorite?
I think for me, it's either the Bishopric of Blackbirds or the Satrapy of Pearls, because I like helpful burbs and I like wandering peddlers. I think that's the extent of my rationale. Yeah.
I do recommend reading the rumors about each of these.
Yeah.
If you read one of these groups and you're like, I want a little bit more or something that's a little bit different, the rumors are great because they do everything from saying everything that you've been reading here is a horrible lie, it's a long con, here's the truth behind what this organization is, to here's some incredible power that they have that nobody knows about, which could become the center of a story.
Which could also be a falsehood.
Could also be a falsehood. The rumors, again, are just rumors. They're only true if you want them to be true in your game.
Yeah. So we close out with some notes on creating an entitlement in-game, which is kind of cool. You need Weird 4 to do it, but then the other pieces are more of the out-of-character stuff I would expect. You need a theme to build around, an oath and a purpose that define the order, the title members will have, and there's a whole sidebar of suggestions here from around the world. You define the prerequisites for joining, give some details about initiation rites, and determine the privileges. There are some notes about how to balance all of this mechanically. It's comparable to the Build Your Own Society rules in the C20 Player's Guide, but a little bit more structured, and it feels more here like a thing any reasonably advanced changeling might choose to do. Like, if your motley has found a purpose, why not formalize it with glamour in some fashion? So,
couldn't agree more. It's a lovely system. I'm glad they include it, and I think that it's important that more books include rules for how to build anything. And I wish they gave information on creating all the other systems.
I feel like I keep pointing to minigames buried within this core book, and here we have yet another. I got by without entitlements at all, but I can certainly see the appeal if you're willing to have this additional axis of character development and story development, admittedly, and character loyalty to account for, whether as a player or as a storyteller. Yeah, they're an interesting spice.
Next up, we've got the Freehold of Miami.
And the story is some kid trying to foist ecstasy on a club goer who turns out to be a fairy princess whose protector steps in and clobbers him in the stomach. Miami!
Fantastic picture of this mortal on the ground looking up at the troll, which is, oh boy, this night is not going to end very nicely for this person.
Nope. And we already saw some of the, I can't remember how many of these characters, if any, we saw in the Quick Start Adventure, but we have seen this setting before. I would just like to read the couple paragraphs that open, because I think it does a lot of heavy lifting for this appendix.
Go for it.
Decadent, sun-drenched Miami, the gateway to the Americas, is a city that epitomizes both the beauty and the darkness at the core of Changeling. From the neon-bedecked skyscrapers of downtown to the Art Deco finery of South Beach and its endless nightclubs, Miami is one of the most beautiful cities in North America. And yet all that bright color hides a heart as dark and fetid as any city in the world of darkness. Drugs flow in from South America, and the authorities are powerless to stop them. Poverty and crime are at obscene levels, and in the weird candy-colored light of the neon, things alien and antithetical to humankind lurk. In the nearby Everglades, paths twist and wind between the mangroves, folding in on themselves and trapping the unwary in a swampy hedge inhabited by ancient crocodilian nightmares. This is not the Miami you may know. This is the Miami of the world of darkness, where all the problems of the real world are magnified and layered atop an ever-shifting foundation of madness and the occult. The surface details are similar, but like a funhouse mirror, the world of darkness reflects a distorted reflection of the world we know. This is a city of excess in all respects. The rich are richer, the hard partiers party harder, and the desperate full of even more desperation. Bienvenidos a Miami. I feel like this might have originally been written for the demo, and I didn't go back to check and see if it was in there, but it feels much more overviewy than I expected.
I don't think the demo gets into as much detail as that.
Yeah, maybe not. Yeah. I didn't like the world of darkness reflects a distorted reflection. I was like, oh, come on.
That is awkward phrasing, though I at least appreciate the sentiment that when they say, we're going to talk about Miami now, they preface it by saying, this is going to be an exaggerated version of the setting that we're discussing for the sake of keeping on theme with our role-playing.
But honestly, I like it. I mean, I know they went through this whole thing about they didn't want to have these determined settings that were like meta-plot heavy, but I think this is great. And I know each game kind of starts with its own little city setting like this, but I love seeing these. I like seeing the take on what the cities are in this world. So
I agree that it's nice that if you get to the end of the book and you don't know what you want to do with the game, that they have something here for you.
Yes. And they give you some structure to build on, because they talk about how theme-wise, conflict is the main idea, as the courts of Miami are on the brink of civil war. Recall from the Quick Start Adventure that the Summer Court refuses to relinquish power, and now there's the added issue of the True Fae creeping around the edges of the Freehold. The mood, meanwhile, is gathering storm to reflect that idea. And they give some inspirations, which include Scarface, Nip Tuck, Dexter, and Miami Vice. A rather eclectic mix. I
think they just said, what is set in Miami?
Yeah, exactly. So there is a brief historical overview that extends from indigenous settlement through Spanish colonialism into modern times. We get notes about the Seminole Wars of the 19th century in Florida, the slow growth followed by tourism boom at the start of the 20th century, events like the Great Miami Hurricane and the Great Depression. More and more Fae stuff gets mixed in along the way, with the local courts, not including Winter, being founded in the 1940s. More recently, Miami did finally get a winter court in the 1960s. There were frictions with the summer court in 1980. The 80s as a decade were seen as the golden age, with an influx of refugees and changelings along with them. The rise of the drug trade, guided by the winter court, and disasters of the 90s kind of led to things breaking down a little bit more. Backing up a little bit, I'm not sure how I feel about the casual attribution of the religion of the Tequesta people to the others. And this is, I think, kind of what I was pointing to, I forget when we talked about this, but my discomfort around sort of leveling out cultural differences within the game. So I think that was something which stood out to me.
That's a good call out. I think the game is at its best when it writes its splats so that these could have been confused and given risen to legends, but they never outright say that. So that if your group feels that they would be comfortable doing something like that you can do your own research and see on how appropriate that would be to do that, but that you can also comfortably have this live alongside that. So a culture can have its beliefs that have nothing at all to do with the Fae, but then the Fae may show up and assume those cultural connotations, or people might mistake them for that and say, oh, this is just part of that.
Yeah.
But I do not think that it's a good idea for the book to ever say, this is the sum whole of it. This is where some aspect or the entirety of a faith or culture comes from.
I must say, White Wolf did kind of learn its lesson along the way in the 90s, and I think they've applied that here by hedging the language a lot. The issue I find is often that it's, even here when it says changeling historians suggest that, and some believe that, give players an inch and they'll take a mile. So it's, I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who wanted to use this setting and didn't want to accept that on face value. But I don't know, maybe there'll be a poll at some point. The lack of meta plot also kind of gives uncertainty as to whether the method of how the courts formed here, where one of the changelings got initiated into, was it Grandfather Thunder?
There were 3 people who found the courts.
Yes.
Originally.
One of them, okay, it was Tom Hood, the Autumn Court. He had gotten inducted in France during World War II and brought back the method to Miami. And then with Grandfather Thunder and Rose Thorn for summer and spring, they formed the Freehold. And it just, without like more context, it makes me wonder, is this typical? In the same way that we talked about how maybe it wasn't the wisest move for the demo story to point to like atypical politics as the launching point. The history here is like, I'm left uncertain as to whether, is this how freeholds form? Is this how courts form?
I'll be honest, I don't like it. I find it weird for them to say that they formed only 3 of the 4 courts and that was...
Yeah.
How did that function? Did that keep the true Fae at bay? It raises a lot of questions about the setting that I don't think are neatly answered. I do appreciate the idea that you can use this as an example of how something doesn't fit neatly with everything.
Mm-hmm.
But my concern is that while I think it's great to have details like that, but I think that they should be details, not foundational aspects of the game.
Yeah.
Setting.
Regardless of how it was supposed to work, it didn't go very well eventually, because on June 21st, 1999, Grandfather Thunder declared that Miami will be the city of endless summer. The courts take umbrage and fighting erupts. The summer court defeats spring and autumn because they didn't work together, so summer was able to defeat them individually, while winter remains neutral. And politics within the Freehold, formerly the Freehold is called the Trident, but things remain tense. Among the courts, Spring is on the verge of self-destruction. Rosethorn is hiding out in the Everglades, and her supposed daughter, Maria, who we saw in the opening story, has created her own little splinter called Vichy Spring in Miami Beach. Summer Court is held together by Grandfather Thunder's leadership and is the most populous and forceful, but there is internal discontent. They have a cool but civil relationship with the Autumn Court, who is only just getting back on its feet since the death of their founder, Tom Hood, and they're feeding on fear all the while, holding themselves apart from the others. And lastly, Winter should be powerful due to their involvement in the drug trade, in particular a new product called fairy dust that opens one's eyes to things fey, but they remain small and weak and contemptuous of the other courts. So, there was a piece that I read, I can't remember if someone shared it on Discord or I shared it, but it was this article from, I think, the 90s about homeless kids and the mythology that formed among them. And it was just fascinating and heartbreaking all at once to see, like, in that situation, how people form mythology. Like, there was, I think it opened with this kid, like an 8-year-old, telling the journalist that they always wanted to sleep under neon lights because angels eat neon light. And it was a story that had been like traded with other kids in shelters and like developed over time. So
Sounds familiar. I don't remember where I heard it.
I think it was
I
on
know
the
the one you're
Discord.
talking about.
I can't remember.
I want to say at this point that the setting of Miami misses the mark for me with their theme of beautiful madness in the game. This is not a bittersweet setting. There's very little about the changing aspect of Miami that sounds exciting and fun and beautiful. It's mostly just the misery of these 4 courts being horribly dysfunctional, at war with each other, and even tearing themselves apart. I'm not a fan of that.
Yeah. I don't think that you're even supposed to really, like, I think it's kind of inviting you to drop your own story into this setting without really giving you much to build it, if that makes sense.
They give you a lot of hooks that you could drop yourself into. Like, do you want to be part of the conflict within Spring? Do you want to take down Grandfather Thunder? But they don't give you much direction on how to do that. And the whole while, you're going to be asking yourself, how do I take the tools that I learned about how changing community works and apply them to a area that does not want to work like I've been told makes the game functional?
It feels a little bit like a dreaming setting plopped into Lost, to be honest.
Really?
Well, just in the sense of there is this sort of extreme focus on the political machinations and not really a lot about the glamorous landscape or the weird landscape, maybe, and kind of the goings on outside of the court strife. Because, like, that's what would interest me. Like, what is the day-to-day experience of the changelings that live there? Are all of them caught up in the court struggles 100% of the time, or do they have other things to deal with? We get, like, the one sidebar with the fairy dust story hook, and I'm like, not my favorite, but cool. At least it's something I can grab onto and pursue. Or, like, they talk about the goblin market, which I'm always ready for. But if you don't really, like, latch on to those, yeah, there's just, it's the politics and the intrigue or nothing. So not particularly engaged with that.
We have a section that gets into the denizens of the freehold, but did we want to talk at all about their descriptions of the locations? They talk about the different districts.
I mean, the conventional wisdom is, oh, you can just look online at this point. I still find these sections useful because they tell you what the authors found important when designing the feel of the city from a game perspective. We don't have to go through them, but I do think it's worth reading to say, you know, okay, at least like you have some little detail that if you're just sending your characters into the city, you can have them drive by it, you can have them run into whatever, and it gives you a little bit of variety within the mix. Things like the Cayocho celebration in Little Havana, things like the Vichy Spring Court is hanging out in Miami Beach, there's new urban legends forming in Coconut Grove, things like that. And naturally, all of this is from nearly 20 years ago, and things have probably changed since then. So,
A lot of the pointers, though, are still useful, like
Yeah.
the story of the great tall tailor man who does terrible things to naughty children who live in Coconut Grove. So these can be worth reading even if you're already familiar with a location or know that things have changed, just for that last paragraph of each, which gives a story hook, which any good setting ought to do.
Yeah. And then we get the denizens of the freehold. So I have just kind of like a brief one-liner about each of these characters, if I may.
Oh, please do.
We have Rose Thorne, one of the original freehold founders, head of the Spring Court, now living in exile in the Everglades and feeling sorry for herself. Her flighty erstwhile daughter Maria Thorne leads the offshoot Vichy Spring Court in Miami Beach, and she is not nearly as capable as she thinks she is. The elemental summer court leader Grandfather Thunder holds tenaciously onto power, but worries about his legacy. His personal bodyguard and assassin, Deathless Ivan, is indeed quite difficult to kill. That's his whole character.
I love the art for these characters, especially Grandfather Thunder, who is shown in the core book, but he is an intimidating looking gentleman with his arms crossed, his gaze down upon you, and the fiery crown upon his brow.
Not to mention his weird 7 trait.
Oh, wow.
Just,
Oh, gosh. Yeah, he's got manipulation 6 and persuasion 6 and that'd be rough. He's got elements 5. Sorry, I'm geeking out about how much stuff this person has. He would actually be truly terrifying to get into a fight.
Yeah, don't cross this guy. The others include Nama, the young gothy queen of autumn, who is quiet and calculating and plotting against summer. Her envoy Cerestes watches for any signs of weakness. He has devilish deceit that hides his paranoia. Jeremiah Sleet is the gang-raised king of winter who looks kind of like a corpse and runs his crew ruthlessly. There's a nice touch about the night of his rebirth was the only time it ever snowed in Miami. And lastly, the courtless Abrer Spider wears multiple identities and appearances as he studies dreams as one of Miami's premier oneiromancers. Note that none of these have entitlements, I just want to point out.
Brer Spider is
my favorite, by far.
Yeah, because Brer Spider is the one that takes contracts and makes them feel more real than I think any other character does. The fact that he makes use of, which one would it be? Probably Mirror, that lets him look like other people, but maybe also dream for. And he uses this in order to make these alternate personas more puissant and real, so that he can play his hand against all of the courts as he wants to. Just a fantastic touch.
Yeah, definitely my fave. So yeah, that's the setting. I mean, I guess it's fine. I don't hate it, but then that's it. Because then we get an index of contracts, pledges, and tokens, which is fantastic to have, and a character sheet. So overall, I had forgotten how dense this thing is. And like I think we talked about last time, I wonder how much of that was a function of them thinking that they had the set number of books to work with and planning accordingly, so sticking as much of the game in the core book as they possibly could. And at some points, though, the writing style got a bit florid or repetitive, taking up extra space. But there is like a metric ton of material in here. There are so many off-ramps into territory that I don't think I ever fully read until we did this read-through, like the particulars of building a fetch. I was like, I don't remember that bit. And when I try to think back to what pulled me in back in the day as a dreaming player, I think it was the aesthetic first, then the sheer variety of splats and crunchy bits and mechanics and treats second, and then the interpretation of themes in the broader setting last. So frosting, then crunch, then fluff. The themes and setting grew on me over time, but in this core book, I don't think the game really quite knows yet what it wants to be, except that it wants to be grim, with 1 or maybe 2 M's. And it feels like a little bit of an overcorrection against bears with balloons. It lacks a lot of the pure bombast that Dreaming had, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just creates a rather different feeling. it took me a while to figure out how I felt about those things, or about those games in relation to each other. And my inclination is just to let each game do what it does best. So through that lens, I mean, there's a lot here, but it's all in the service of the thing that they're creating, which I appreciate. It got a little bit weird and abstract, but I think that's basically it.
On my end, I was initially caught probably because, hey, the cover of the book is my favorite color. Green.
Yeah.
I instantly attractive towards me. I had not played or I think even read Changing the Dreaming before checking out Changing the Lost first edition. That was my introduction to the concept of Changeling as Changeling. And I'm not sure I ever had the point where I felt like I was picking favorites between Changing the Lost and Changing the Dreaming because they always seemed like pretty different games to me. Though reading this now and having done that interview with Pete, I can see the overlap where Lost is taking some inspiration from Dreaming. I think what really captured my heart first was the urban fantasy element of the game. That
Hmm.
this is the first time I felt like you can have a setting where your characters can just kind of be people and they don't have an immediate, always on threat to their existence or compulsion to doing something, but you can and sometimes must delve into this world of magic and wonder. Later on, what more attracted me was the idea of the found family aspect, the bittersweet moments, the acceptance, the community that comes out of it, but also the unique challenges that community faces. And I feel like the game never loses sight of that. Coming back to the first edition is a trip for me because this has a lot of the lines that I had thought were in second edition. A lot of the artwork that I thought was in second edition, but no, it's in here. I think the detail is, on one hand, it's a bit much in the sense that, yes, I agree. They get repetitive. I don't think we need the same concept drilled into our head 3 times, or if they're going to do it, they could have done it a little bit more elegantly. But I feel like the core conceits, the idea of, say, the biggest and most powerful trods lead directly to fairy, that changeling struggle to map everything, that you have a spectrum of reactions that are broad enough that they have 4 courts to cover it, but even that doesn't cover it with concepts like the soulless, the mad, the bridge burners, and militia. That I think it creates a wonderful toolbox for people to set things up for a game. I think you have everything you need here to run Changing the Lost if you have an idea of where you want to set the game. And I think they give you enough guidance to set it somewhere. I think the biggest challenge that someone might face coming into this is that, maybe even more so than the other game lines that came before it, Changeling the Lost First Edition has an emphasis upon the uncertainty of your situation. Changelings don't fully understand what Arcadia or even the True Faith, their primary antagonists, are. The hedge is a wonderful and dangerous place that they are forever mapping and encountering new denizens. That's beautiful but scary, and it can also be frustrating for someone coming into the game for the first time to just say, you might just say, please just tell me what's actually going on so I can figure out everything else from there. But if you like that kind of thing, I think it's fantastic. I think they give us plenty of advice towards it. And if it's something that you struggle with, always remember that you can make a decision for yourself on what works best for your interpretation of Lost. You're welcome to go with the most obvious interpretations that they lay down in this book, or come up with something that is uniquely fitting for your game and your table. So I recommend seeing that as a strength. Those are my thoughts.
It's interesting that you point to this as being more of an urban fantasy game than Dreaming, because I think that speaks a little bit to I mean, obviously the different flavors of urban fantasy out there, but also maybe the way dreaming has evolved over the editions. Because, yeah, I don't know. It's I have a different take. We should have an episode on that in particular.
That might become an episode, because my feeling is that in Changing the Dreaming, where you have that strong distinction between your human and your fey elements and the interacting of them can be inherently toxic, as opposed to Lost, where there's more external forces that keep you from merging those two worlds. Like, you'll just make life worse for everybody else around you and maybe not help yourself. A lot to think about. You're right. That's worth an episode.
And it is sort of, I mean, I'm trying to like think ahead to the supplements that we're going to read, and I'm trying to really remember, like, a lot of them, if I'm remembering correctly, just feel like expansions on things that are already in here. I don't think there's any truly earth-shaking new system, at least in the first 6 books. It's mostly just like, here are more kiths, more antagonists, more court politics.
That seems right to me. One of the things that readers can look forward to, depending upon how much you like Miami, is that although they don't progress the meta plot for that they use it as examples in their books when they want to give you material. So you have a foundation for doing those things, and if you want to expand the city of Miami, you've still got material to use, even if it doesn't say something like, and this is the book where Grandfather Thunder gets taken down.
Right. So we have a few questions from listeners on our Discord. I guess like some of these, I don't know if we want to answer, if we each both answer all of them. But for starters, Vanek asks, what part of the core book do you like best?
For me, the part I like best is, gosh, there's so many great things. But I love the entitlements. For me, they take all of the abstract stuff the game says about how changing communities form and how changelings react to things, how their magic functions, and they make it feel real. It's something concrete that you can point to in the game, and that adds something beautiful to it.
I was going to say the maximalism of the book as a whole overall is something I really admire. Why give one example when you could give 10? But some really, there's some really fun little ideas that come out of that approach if you're willing to sift for them. In terms of like a discrete part, like a discrete chunk of text, honestly, I think I like the court descriptions the best. They make themselves clearer than silly or unsilly ever do. But I also like the mini games for Oath and Pledges, and I like the dream weaving systems in Chapter 3. All of that's pretty good. Entitlements too. I mean,
Oniromaki.
Yeah, like anything with the prefix Oniro, I am on board for.
Andrew Goodman asks, I've often heard people muse on how Lost and Dreaming could be run together in the same game. What are your thoughts on this idea?
Actually, my response directly ties into the comment, so do you want to read the comment?
Sure. So Andrew's comment is, personally, I think it's a fascinating idea, as each can highlight the themes of the other. Although it does require a bit of meta editing of the lore, having dreaming changelings see how much humanity they have gained, and the Lost having an easier way of confronting their abusers in the form of the now altered dreaming fae has some really interesting potential, as well as makes the dreaming true fae more monstrous. Just how much has the mist protected them from what they once were? Did the Gentry think the main punishment to those they kicked out of Arcadia was becoming so much more human?
So I have a hard time thinking of Lost and Dreaming being run together or overlapped precisely because of the thoughts in that comment. I mean, I think it's a really interesting description. I would read that as a story. I think it's an interesting thought experiment or even a parable. But I think that if you were to have that kind of overlap as fait accompli in your game setting, you end up sort of flattening out the themes of both games. And I think you would have to roleplay through it properly in order to really make it work. I don't think you can just dump both games into a single space. And to roleplay through it would be very difficult. Were I to mash them together, though, I think my point of lore that would bridge the gap would essentially be to have the gentry as some segment of the Fomorians and or the Tuatha, because I can see them in their like undefined weirdness transcending the dreaming to reach out to the old and the new world of darkness as almost like parallel dimensions. So on one Earth, they simply give early culture dreams a boop on the snoot and sit back to watch the kits emerge, while in the other, they scoop mortals up and mold them as they wish. If you go for it, you have to go all in, I would say. But squashing the mechanics together ain't great either, so I think you can take themes and ideas from one game and consider how they would be contextualized in the other, but full-on mashing them together just doesn't do either game any justice, or enough justice.
I agree. And we could certainly spend an entire episode talking about different ways that we can combine them. But for now, few thoughts on that are I wouldn't just try to say they both coexist. I don't think that works neatly. If you want to try doing that, you have to do at least some work. Like I, for example, decided, well, what if I put some elements of loss into dreaming? And I think that works easily enough because you can recontextualize the themes of the loss, feeling like outsiders from both human and fey society, into dreaming, which is about things that have found a place in both mortal and fey society. There is a great space for that in there. Or you can take elements from the dreaming, which oftentimes has a higher power scale with what the characters are capable of, or the privilege they have within the dreaming, and make that a feature element of maybe high weird changelings, or even just recontextualize them as keepers who, as true fae, that have undergone some sort of fundamental transformation. There's a lot of beauty to be had in mixing the themes of the game, which is, I think, part of what makes this so exciting to discuss.
Yeah. So then Seb asks, to fetch, what was your favorite thing from the first edition core that didn't get translated into second edition?
Entitlements. Entitlements do exist in second edition, but I have a couple problems with the change. First, entitlements are not at all in the core book.
Yeah.
And then when they did show up, they switched from being a secret society that you joined with a bunch of privileges and cultural aspects that I liked to being a single story for your character. That's cool in its own way, and they get a lot of neat benefits out of it that are more high powered than what we get from the entitlements in first edition. But I really miss that communal social aspect of it. I don't want there to be just one scarecrow minister or a single Duchess of the Icebound Heart. I want a whole group that people can join and play around with. And that aspect simply, there's a nod towards it, but it's not the focus in Entitlements. And despite them being an appendix for first edition, I love them so much that I really miss that.
There's not so much a multiplicity of duchesses in the second edition core book.
The next question is from Chig, asking you, what was your favorite thing from the 1E core that did not get translated to second edition?
I have thoughts. I have edition thoughts. I mean, I like entitlements too. Even though I haven't used them, I'm glad they exist, and I agree with your statement there. I also have to put in a word for the full mini game of oaths and pledges that we got in this core book, because I don't think second edition developed them nearly as far. They were a little bit looser, and that may work. I tend to be a little bit more improvisational when I put things like that together, but I loved all of the little intricacies that we had in chapter 3 of this book. So
I agree with you. That's a great point, that first edition Changeling introduces the concept of this more freeform system for interacting with oaths and pledges, and even later on gets into systems for the like other things you can do with Changeling magic. And I feel like second edition could have further expanded upon that. And they kind of do, but not nearly as much as I would have liked them to have done.
Next season we'll get to that. So then Elris asks, I have limited experience with Lost, but in that experience it seems much lighter on the meta-narrative than Dreaming. Do you feel this is an improvement and allows greater flexibility in the presentation of a chronicle, or could Lost have used a bit more narrative fiber?
I'm going to start as the person who was struggling when I came into Dreaming.
Gasp.
Because I had an easy time with Lost, because all I had to do was figure out what's a core concept that I love. I like isekai, and I could reframe the concept of Lost as isekai, reverse isekai, and from there an entire campaign sprung. And I had all the tools that I needed to support that. When I got to Dreaming, I was hit with a ton of material, both mechanical and lore-wise, and some meta-narrative stuff, but there were a couple of issues with it. One is that the meta-narrative stuff that I often got was irrelevant, like, what does King David's isolation have to do with what's happening in Phoenix, Arizona? What do I do when I don't like what it says about Phoenix? Do I reframe that? And what do I do with this lore? I didn't feel like there was enough storyteller guidance coming into it as a new person to just say, here is a way you take the themes of Dreaming and make that into a game, which I feel is ironic because there is actually a lot of fantastic stuff you can do with the lore pieces of Dreaming and the meta-narrative. Elris, you asked the question yourself, but in a game that you ran for me, you did take a bit of that with Milge and turn that into something that was...
that guy.
It was a amazing narrative that we got out of bringing that into the game. It's just hard to see as a new storyteller coming into it.
I have to just point out that's C20. That's C20's fault. Because
okay,
honestly, just because the second edition core book in particular, and I guess the first edition to some extent, now that I'm thinking back, they were very meta plot light. I think David may have gotten a passing mention, but in particular because I would say first edition Dreaming was really leaning hard into the Immortal Eyes saga as its central storyline. And then second edition was the reset on that, where it was no, we're going to focus more on the David stuff. The core book for second edition was so light on the meta, and it really only built up in the succeeding books, which then C20 gathered all together. Now, as a kitchen sink edition book, I'm grateful for that, and I think it is helpful for people who want to dive into it, so they don't have to pour through Kingdom of Willows and War in Concordia and Fool's Luck and all of those. But at the same time, I agree with you that it is a steep learning curve if you're reading through the core book and you're like, oh, I need to understand all of this and how it fits in. And I say that as someone who has pretty much never actually used the meta plot in a relevant way in any of my games. Because, yeah, it's just not something I'm into. But to answer the question a little more directly, I don't think we necessarily needed meta plot in the sense of following a long story through the books. What I would have liked to see in here, though, is more about the inter-freehold structure of Fae society. How do Fae command respect from place to place? How do they cultivate allies? We get the history of the Miami Fae in Appendix 2, but it's not really instructive for designing other cities and designing connections that Miami might have to those other cities. It's fine if you want to have this isolated setting for your table, but I think it's hard to run those without at least acknowledging other places in the world, To some extent, it puts power in the storyteller's hands to let them fill in those details, but what the writers sacrificed by doing that was a measure of their own control over how the game could be defined. And there are plenty of games that can maintain themselves in this achronic present, disconnected from a timeline or something that's divorced from a map. But it's hard to do that when you're playing in a shadow of the real world. Although maybe, now that I'm saying that, maybe that would be a good way to kind of foment paranoia that sort of like Pleasantville. Every time the players start to try to find out something about a freehold in another city, it's like, oh, suddenly the phone's not working. Or they try to go there and it's, oh, the car's broken down. Why can't we leave our freehold?
That's unsettling.
Yeah.
It's true. You don't get details on other locations. I think for people who are looking for that kind of how do I build a meta if I only have the CTL1E core book, your best bet is to go back to the first part of the storytelling chapter and to reread the core books section in chapter 1 about Changeling society.
Yeah.
That gives a lot of guidance on what changelings care about, how they structure themselves, why they structure themselves. And that can be some great guidance for you when building up something in your city. A really easy way to do this, think about some issue or concern that's happening in the real world, whether on the grand scale or in your city or just something that you personally care about. Filter that through the lens of Changeling, and you can build an entire campaign around that concept.
Oh, show.
Next up, we have Simon S. saying, unlike most TTRPGs, Changing the Lost doesn't start with a balanced power dynamic between the protagonists and the antagonists. The True Fae are leagues above the player characters in power and potential threat. How have you, or would you deal with this to ensure player agency?
So I'm going to speak to this first from the second edition perspective because we've regularly had to team up against Huntsmen. I would say for taking down lesser godlike beings, teamwork does go a long way, and I'd say a group of changelings at weird 3 or higher, maybe, could probably fend off the weakest keepers. But honestly, I tend to keep them out of the equation as much as possible. I find them much more effective as story elements than like dots on the sheet foes. And it gives you a lot more freedom to define them through rumor and cameo appearances and so forth. Actually, if you want to really foment paranoia, give all your players a free ally at the start of the game and then end your first session with the keepers coming for that guy, just to really ratchet things up. But it still allows players to have their usual agency. They can decide whether to try to take down this enemy or not, whether to investigate, whether to hide. And you just have to make it clear that unless they are sufficiently powerful and working together like a well-oiled machine, they don't stand a chance. So treat them as this force of nature within your setting, not something to be directly combated against necessarily, or something that's going to abduct them at the first opportunity. As we saw elsewhere in the core book, it's pointed out that the Fae don't reclaim changelings nearly as much as the changelings think. You're not obligated to turn every encounter into a fight, and I think that's important.
And speaking more to first edition, going just off what we have here, I think this applies equally well to second edition. There's a few things to keep in mind to avoid this. One is doubling down on what Puka said. You don't need every adventure to be the True Fae shows up and comes to have a one-on-one duel with the PCs. That's not a great
Unlikely
story. It's very unlikely to happen in the first place, and it's not very exciting. There's a few ways that you can handle this. So, one, keep the True Fae and other powerful antagonists in the back. The Fae do not like to enter the mortal world, and they often prefer working through agents for a variety of reasons. Focus more upon the threats that they send after you, such as privateers and loyalists. It's easier to take down one cultist of the True Fae than it is to take on the True Fae and his small army of changelings and hedge denizens that are there to support them. The other thing is to remember that changelings are really big on community in Lost. They have trouble trusting each other, but when they can trust each other, either because of the pledges that they sign or because of the fierce friendship they just sometimes naturally form, that having 5 people with the backing of ostensibly 100 other changelings to fight off a major threat is a really powerful thing that I think speaks to the more optimistic and brilliant elements of the game setting. There's nothing quite like it when you describe all the changelings getting together and they're arrayed with fantastical weaponry and magic and pushing into the hedge as a unified force of fierce, powerful bonds and emotions to push back the threat and say that we're not going to be intimidated by you. We're not going to let you win. We're together in this.
Just saying, dreaming has community too, but you know.
Also a fair point. The last thing I want to say on this is, as a storyteller for any game, I always recommend having mentor figures. When I've run Changing the Lost and the Freehold, I made the Freehold monarchs accessible to the PCs. They'd be there to answer questions, and if there was something that the PCs could not handle, the monarchs could assist them. So if I needed an excuse for why some true Fae or terrible force wasn't there, I could say, well, the courts are actually dealing with that in the background, so they're not an immediate threat, but I could also ratchet up the heat on that if I want that to be a threat later. Or if the PCs get in over their heads and there's a gluttonous giant and his horde of ogres coming for you, well, you can go to the more powerful characters and say, can we please get some support on this? You shouldn't use this as a way of getting rid of the story, but as a safety valve to avoid situations where the campaign ends because the players make an honest mistake and now you don't know how to fix it.
Which, players will always do given enough time. So, last but not least, Elris has one more asking, I'm not super familiar with Lost First Edition, but apparently it too had a revision to kiths and seemings between First and Second Edition. Apparently in First Edition, certain kiths were restricted to certain seemings. Want to be a flame siren? Well, you must be a fairest. Did this structure add to seeming and Durrant's identity, or was it simply an unnecessary tight-laced restriction?
I think this is something that we're going to see more of when we get to the book in First Edition about kiths. But first, to explain the change they made. In First Edition, you have your seemings, and then within each seeming is a set of kiths. Then in Second Edition, they changed it so that any seeming can mix with any kith. I like the free-flowing structure of that because it added a lot of elements to the game, so you can more easily be whatever it is that you want to be. I do think that it's a fair concern that this would lose the potential uniqueness of seemings and kiths by saying, all draconics are fairest. What does that say about the setting? But unfortunately, I don't feel like the First Edition core book does much of anything with that idea, despite them saying that it can be important to the game. So I think it can be an interesting restriction, but I don't think the game has done its due diligence to show us how that restriction can be interesting.
Fair point. I'm going to stand up for First Edition here a little bit, because I think it's a little bit unfair to call it an unnecessary tight-laced restriction, because kiths are different here. Kiths are derived from seemings in the first place in First Edition. So, yes, it is restricted here in the sense that kiths are, at their root, further specifications of the transformations you endured represented by your seeming. Whereas in Second Edition, they're more about your role or the role that you had within the Keeper's story. So they are fundamentally kind of pointing to different things. As a sidebar, I hope we're not going to have to deal with edition wars within Lost. Like, I know that there's some first versus second edition discourse, but I only have so many hours in the day. Can't we just love both of these editions, please? That was my public service announcement for this episode. So as for whether the structure in first edition adds to seeming endurance identity, I would say so, but I also agree with your point that the book doesn't really give you much in that direction. Personally, I never found the kiths to be constraining in terms of determining what I wanted to do with the character or what I could do with the character. But yeah, I don't know. Both systems have been fine with me within their respective games.
That is it for all of the questions that we have for today.
Whew. And I guess, well, that seems as good a segue as any to talk about where people can send questions, if they so choose. Unless, do you have anything else to say about the core book before I collapse into a pile of pumpkin guts?
Just that it's been an absolute delight to return to this book, and I'm looking forward to delving back into the supplements. It's been a while, and this is as exciting as I hoped it would be.
Can I say on the subject of pumpkin guts, there's a house up the street from me that put a pumpkin out for Halloween, and they've just let it sit, and it has now become this kind of mustard-colored patch on their stoop. It's really weird and gross. Anyway, on that visual note, if you would like to join the conversation around our podcast, you have a number of options for doing so, beginning first and foremost with our Discord server at discord.me/CTP. You can hang out and ask questions and comment, etc. If Discord isn't your thing, we also have an email at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com. We're on Facebook and YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. Our Mastodon is changelingpod at dice.camp, and our Patreon is patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Links to all of these will be in the show notes to this episode.
I'd like to add, on the Discord, every episode has its own channel, and it's a great place to go to bring up your thoughts and your questions, and generally speaking, submit as many questions as you might have. Anything that you're wondering about, somebody else probably wonders as well, and it's fun for us to think about the answers to these questions.
And it also helps us to feel like we're not just shouting into the ether.
That is also important.
Please validate our work. Anyway, with that, I have been Puka.
And I have been Fetch.
And I guess we've closed the core book, but the journey through the Library of Lost is just beginning. So, be ready. Be ready for the ride. Live your life. Don't take candy from scarecrows. They need it more than you. That's all I got.
Thus endeth our read-through of the Changeling the Lost First Edition core book, which took weeks of planning, tens of thousands of words of notes, several hours of recording, and more coffee than a human body should sensibly consume to get through. We hope it has been informative, but we also hereby disavow any responsibility for the clarity checks you and your table may endure should you attempt to actually read the book yourselves. In such cases, 4 out of 5 keepers recommend that you consume a slice or two of plangerine, a goblin fruit that sharpens multitasking skills and sequential thinking. 6 out of 5 keepers are all too happy to let you harvest it freely from their own gardens. But if you'd rather just continue listening as we continue down this path of mad beauty, that's fine too, and rather than the orchards of Faerie, maybe you'd rather just come hang out in our Discord-based freehold. If you like our show, please consider leaving us a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, or supporting us on Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Folks who have already done so, thereby earning the Palatinate of Awesomeness entitlement, include Bad Company, Derek, Torquidus, Ellerus, Hugo the Bogperson, Ia Bull, Jason Vines, Oreo, Roz Caboose, Sanchiger, Sija, and Simon Strand. Extra special thanks to them, and regular special thanks to all listeners who make this boondoggle worthwhile, enough at least for us to wish that you hedge jewel safe, glamour strong, and keep on dreaming.